Hello everyone, my name is Francesca Camilli, and today I'll be presenting my case study on the Soviet Union's invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, also known as the Joint Operation by the Warsaw Pact countries. This event was one of the most defining moments of the Cold War because it demonstrated how far the Soviet Union was willing to go to maintain control over Eastern Europe. My presentation will examine what happened, why it mattered to U.S. national security, how President Lyndon B. Johnson and the National Security Council responded, and what lessons this event still provides for intelligence professionals and policymakers today. The invasion occurred during a period known as the Prague Spring. Earlier in 1968, Czechoslovakia's new leader, Alexander Dubček, introduced a series of political and economic reforms designed to create what he called socialism with a human face. These reforms included greater freedom of speech, reduced censorship, and increased political openness. The Soviet Union viewed these reforms as a serious threat. Soviet leaders feared that if Czechoslovakia became more independent, other Eastern Bloc countries might follow, weakening Soviet influence throughout the region. On the night of August 20th and 21st, 1968, approximately 250,000 troops from the Soviet Union and several Warsaw Pact allies entered Czechoslovakia. Their objective was to end the reforms and restore strict communist control. Although there was widespread public resistance, the invasion succeeded militarily and effectively ended the Prague Spring. The central issue was not simply that one country invaded another. The broader issue was whether the Soviet Union would allow political independence within its own sphere of influence. By using military force, the Soviet leadership made it clear that maintaining control over Eastern Europe was more important than respecting national sovereignty. This mattered greatly to U.S. national security because it tested America's broader strategy of containing Soviet expansion without triggering direct conflict between two nuclear superpowers. President Johnson's administration strongly condemned the invasion, but military intervention was never considered a realistic option. The United States was already deeply involved in the Vietnam War, and any direct confrontation with Soviet forces carried the risk of escalating into a much larger conflict. Ultimately, the administration relied on diplomacy, intelligence assessments, and cooperation with NATO allies instead of military action. From the U.S. government's perspective, the primary objective was to respond firmly while avoiding direct military confrontation with the Soviet Union. The National Security Council met immediately after the invasion to assess possible responses. The State Department coordinated diplomatic protests with U.S. allies, while the Department of Defense monitored Soviet military activity across Europe. The CIA played a particularly important role by collecting intelligence on Soviet troop movements and assessing Soviet intentions before and during the invasion. Although U.S. intelligence successfully identified warning signs that military action was becoming increasingly likely, policymakers had very limited response options. The ongoing Vietnam War consumed significant military resources and political attention, making intervention in Eastern Europe both strategically and politically unrealistic. As a result, the United States relied on diplomacy, intelligence, and alliance coordination rather than military force. For my structured analytic technique, I chose a SWOT analysis because it provides a balanced way to evaluate the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats associated with the U.S. response. The greatest strength was that the United States avoided a direct conflict with the Soviet Union, reducing the risk of nuclear escalation while maintaining NATO unity. Intelligence collection also remained strong throughout the crisis. However, there were important weaknesses. The United States was unable to prevent or reverse the invasion, and the Vietnam War significantly limited American options. Soviet leaders likely understood that the U.S. was unlikely to intervene militarily. The crisis also created opportunities to strengthen NATO cooperation, improve intelligence sharing, and reinforce diplomatic coordination among allies. At the same time, it highlighted continuing threats, including increased Soviet aggression, greater Cold War tensions, and the ongoing danger of nuclear confrontation. Looking back, I believe this was a critical national security event because it reinforced the importance of balancing military power, intelligence, and diplomacy during international crises. One of the biggest lessons is that good intelligence alone does not determine policy. Even though the United States had warning that Soviet intervention was becoming increasingly likely, national leaders still had to weigh intelligence against broader strategic priorities, including avoiding a wider war. If I were advising the National Security Council at the time, I would have emphasized closer coordination among the intelligence community, the State Department, the Department of Defense, and NATO allies to strengthen diplomatic pressure and prepare for future crises. The lesson that surprised me most was how accurately intelligence identified Soviet intentions before the invasion, yet policymakers still had very few practical options for changing the outcome. For this project, I relied primarily on government publications, declassified intelligence documents, historical archives, and academic research. These sources included the U.S. Department of State's Foreign Relations on the United States series, the CIA Reading Room, the National Security Archive, NATO, and several respected historians specializing in the Cold War. Using multiple independent sources helped verify the facts and reduced the risk of relying on any single perspective. While some Soviet records remain incomplete, I am confident that these sources provide a well-documented and balanced understanding of both the invasion itself and the U.S. national security response. Thank you for listening.